This is Again for the First Time with your host, Darren Redmond.
Hello, everybody. You know, I like all my guests, but this one is personal to me. And again, you listen to Again for the First Time with your host, Darren Redmond. And this is one that, next week is my 59th birthday. And this one is literally 50 plus years in the making. My guest is Garrett Webster, the son of one of my heroes growing up, Mike Webster. Played center, was the, lack of a better term, the center of the action on the offensive line for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. What it meant to be an offensive lineman, what it meant to be just a man playing a sport. Loved everything about the man. Those of you know later on in my life what I did in terms of non-for-profit work and helping people in addiction and trauma and everything else. This man's story has resonated with me. I am humbled that you're with me today, Garrett. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's actually a beautiful weather out here in Pittsburgh. We had a couple days of rain that we desperately needed, but the weather's pretty good. Other than the Steeler game on Sunday.
What happened? Let's start there. What happened?
Every Steelers coach from Cower to, there's only been 2. That's the thing. You hate to say every Steelers coach, but then you realize you're only talking about 2 or 3 guys, literally. And Cower did this, and it's something that whatever with the organization, they go into a game that they should win and they should win easy. They end up either playing down to their competition or not coming in as prepared as they should be. And then they'll, the next week they'll play some team that's 15-0 or something, and you think the Steelers are going to get crushed, and they'll end up, winning the game easily. You saw it, I think, when they went 11-0 that one year. Started off. Granted, that season went pretty terrible after that, but and Tomlin's like Coward. They're one of those coaches that if they can rally around that kind of underdog mentality, they do really well with it. But if you get them the favorite mentality, they for whatever reason they tighten up, they change how they play, they change how they coach, and they're not able to do that. I think that in sports, I think one of the toughest things is having a team that's expected to win or expect it, and we're obviously talking about just a regular season game, but it starts there. If you're expected to win regular season games, and you can't do it, that's not going to work well when you get in the playoffs. Or you get to the games where it really counts. And for whatever reason, I do really like Mike Tomlin. I think he's a really good coach. I actually think he's a better coach than Cower, which is
I do too.
I think some people, they have a little bit rose-colored glasses when it comes to Cower. But with Cower, he had a lot of teams that should have done a lot better than they did. And then the year they win the Super Bowl, it's the team that everybody thought was going to get bounced out in the first round. And that's kind of that, what do they call it? The perfect storm. This team that, they were the last team in. They were all 3 road games in the playoffs. 3 of those games, I can't remember who they beat in the championship game, but I remember they played the Colts, and they just came out and barely won that one. And then week before that, I remember they played Cincinnati, and that was the first year that kind of Cincinnati had a real good year. I think that was. What's his name? That defense coordinator was real good. Kind of bounced around.
Yep.
Can't remember his.
I know who you mean.
The black guy. I can't remember his name. For some reason, it's blanking right now.
Right.
But remember that was the game where Carson Palmer blew out his knee, and everybody thought the Bengals were going to be the team that year.
Yep.
And it was just a perfect storm, and they ended up winning it all. But there was other teams those years that. The Steelers, how many times they get the championship game and lose to the Patriots, lose to the Colts, or not the Colts, Denver. I remember that year where I think it was Elway's first Super Bowl.
Yep.
No, his second Super Bowl. It was second.
Well,
the second or first.
Right. The first one is when they lost when they beat the Jets in the AFC Championship game. The Jets were up 10-0, and then they.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the second one, because that was when they beat I believe they beat Kansas City in a game
Mm-hmm.
that Kansas City should have won, and it was one of those ice bowl games. And then that was the same year Cordell kind of had, that was that year that Cordell really almost won the MVP and maybe should have won the
Should
MVP
have.
that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was really good, and then he got in the playoffs, and they just crapped the bed.
Yep.
And I think that's the thing that they forget a lot about when they look at Tomlin now, is those things were the same things that Cowher did, and he didn't necessarily do well with it. That's not there's a ton of people in the Hall of Fame as coaches who couldn't do those things and do as well as Cowher did, or it did as good as Tomlin does, or something like that. There's really only, especially in football, there's only like 3 or 4 coaches that you can really name that could take a team that was thought of to be, a winning team and then coach them all the way through. And there's a lot more guys that did better at that underdog aspect.
You mentioned something on your social media a couple of days ago that I didn't even know we we're going to talk about here, but you kind of talking about this, and that is the wonderful job that Chuck Noll did after those Super Bowls. I mean, you look at that team with Mark Malone and quarterback. They were not a great team, and they made it to the championship game against the Dan Marino Dolphins, or was it David Woodley Dolphins? I forget which.
That was Marino's rookie year. That was the year he went and played Montana in the Super Bowl. And, everybody said, that famous story about him having the tuxedo, and him, somebody telling Marino that he was going to be back for plenty more. And that was the last time he ever got there. Yep. And, I think that the crazy thing, especially about football, because so much of it is about the way the game is played. There seems like there's these seasons in football where you really see the league kind of evolve. And I think that 84 game, the Steelers, they won their 4 Super Bowls, and they kind of had a year or two where it seemed like, guys were starting to get old. Terry was starting to get there. You started to see teams put more emphasis with the quarterback of managing a game and high complete. The crazy thing about Terry is that he only had a 50% career completion percentage. So, it's not like now where, unless a quarterback is 17 of 21 for 250 yards and 3 touchdowns, it's get him out of there and get somebody else in. Back in the, early 80s and stuff like that, people were a lot more forgiving about what, they want. It's like in baseball, somebody could go 4 for 4 with 4 singles in baseball, and it was, he's a hell of a player. Now it's, if he goes 1 for 4 with 1 solo home run and 3 strikeouts, it's, that's the player we want.
Right.
And it's, that's just how sports is. And I think that with Chuck Noll, I do think he, one of the crazy things you were talking about social media, actually had asked on there, because they were talking about Zach Frazier and how he had a bad snap at the end of the game, the Colts game. And I said, when did Chuck Noll actually start running the shotgun? Because I didn't, it's one of those weird kind of things. At some point in time, a first has to happen. Somebody said the first actual play they ran with a shotgun was after my dad left, that year after my dad left. So it wasn't until like the 3rd or 4th game of the season they ran a shotgun play, and in a way, it shows how slow maybe Chuck was to change some of his offensive strategies and stuff like that. But also, the Steelers always had a big, good running game. And they always ran a lot of traps, a lot of blocks. And the truth is that if you watch football today, a lot of those teams that still run really well, they run a lot of those same kind of concepts, pulling their center, trapping, pulling and stuff like that.
Counter trays, all of that. Yeah.
Not that they couldn't run the ball with just your normal straight up, blocking. But again, in today's NFL, the running game and the running back is greatly removed from what the game is. It's now it's about passing and stuff like that. And that's kind of a crazy thing. But I think that Chuck Noll during those years, especially I think after that game versus Miami in 84, I think it was 84 was actually, I think it was 83 to 84 season. I think he saw the writing on the wall and said, there's guys here. Cause I think Lambert played 1 more year and retired the next year. Mean Joe was, I think, that done after that game.
Yes,
I think he retired. Stalwart stuck around until the same time my dad left. But after that, it was pretty much everybody was gone.
I was going to say that your dad and Stallworth were the 2 that continued and played at a very high level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also is that a guy like, Stallworth was he was based on technique, and he was very, I don't know what his most catches in the season were, but he was reliable, and he was a guy that was gonna, if he was open and he had a chance at the ball, he was going to catch that ball. And I think that he was kind of those guys that you need to, and I think you're seeing it right now if you watch the Steelers play. Anybody who's watched Steelers play this season, you see a team, okay, they've got a George Pickens who's that big home run threat, and he can obviously, catch the ball, but you need those tough wide receivers that are sure-handed, can get open, get underneath. And I think every single team or franchise has, a wide receiver, especially, the Jets with Wayne Corbett, or
Yes.
you look at, the Giants when they were doing well, they had Monty Toomer, they had, some of those guys that were just good at catching the ball and somehow getting yards and stuff like that. But I think that at the end of that 84 season, the league was now advancing into a passing league. And I think Chuck knew that they didn't have necessarily players at that point in time to really compete. I don't think they had a winning season after that, those 4 years after that, when I think they were pretty terrible, actually. But, and this is something my dad always said, is that they used that time to kind of, when they were rebuilding, to get younger players, get guys in there. Chuck took time to expand and change the way he coached the team. And, when he retired in 92, I believe it was, he was still a relatively young man. You look at these coaches now who are coaching until they're, in their 60s or something. I think Chuck was in his mid 50s when he retired. Dad said he could have ended up, and nobody from the Steelers was going to force him out. And I think he could have said, I want to take one more shot and stay, but, he left, and a lot of those players that Bill Cowher did well with, and same thing with Tomlin. Tomlin got some players from Cowher when he left that were still there. Troy Polamalu, Lamar Woodley, stuff like that. There were guys there, Hines Ward, Ben, of course, and stuff like that. And that's, I think one of the things the Steelers do really well is their coaches and even their players understand they're stewards of a position or stewards of a team, rather than I'm the only person for this team. You know what I mean? It's some of these guys, you look at the Cowboys, and, Jerry Jones, I guarantee you, in his head thinks the Cowboys won't exist without me. I think he's convinced that the day he dies, and he will never give up that position of being general manager and stuff like that until he dies. But I guarantee you, he thinks that the day he dies, the Cowboys will just cease to exist. And I think that, I think that's one of the biggest problems in not just sports, but society is guys don't look at it that there's going to be people coming after. And the best thing you can do for your legacy is to leave something for the guys who are coming out to you to be successful. And I think that's what my dad saw with Dermontti Dawson coming there. And I think, with the Steelers, I think you saw that, like I said, with Chuck Noll leaving a good team for Cowher. Cowher left a good team for Tomlin. And I hope that continues whenever it's time for Tomlin to leave. There's good people to come in, and every franchise should shoot for that.
I mean, obviously I grew up Steeler fan and a Jet fan, had season tickets for the Jets forever. And I bring up the fact of your dad, and you're talking about legacies. I don't know if they ever crossed paths or not, but I always used to look at Kevin Mawai. He played with the Titans and then the Jets.
Yeah.
Very much like your dad. I mean, he's there every day. Not making it, not falling off sides, not a lot of holes. Just getting the job done.
I've never seen this, and it would be something that I would love to look into or see, but I can't really remember any team in football, especially that's been at least decently successful. I mean, even if the rest of their line is terrible, if they don't at least have that solid center that they can count on. I would be surprised to look to see whether it's, was a guy an all-pro that year? Was he a second team all NFL or something like that? Because, I can't really think of a team out of the top of my head, that had a really bad center and did well in the playoffs and did, and I think that Dad, for whatever reason, I think was one of the first players that people really recognized. Because I think, especially up until the mid 1970s, people just looked at linemen as big dumb guys that get in the way, and that's it. I mean, every once in a while, you'd see, the linemen that people knew, Anthony Munoz, and I always forget his name, and I never mean to. There was a tackle for New England that my dad was a big, big fan of, they didn't think of those guys as being anything more than just guys that got in the way. And I think, especially with Dad, because whether it was his look or whatever, people saw him making the calls on the offensive line.
Yep.
So again, I think people understood how important having that center was, and doing blocking schemes, and having a guy who wasn't just physically capable and having the skills to do his job, but also to know other people's jobs on the line. And I know that, with my dad, when he came in, and this is another example of how much the game has changed. When my dad came in, he didn't start really for his first 2 years. His first year, he pretty much just did punts and field goals and would play, probably a handful of regular snaps a game. But I know his first 2 years, he rotated on all the positions of the line, even playing tackle. And you're talking about a guy who's, 6'2", and his rookie year, he was only about probably 240, 245 playing tackle. I don't think you'd see that. I think it'd be tough for them to have a running back at that size. They'd say he's undersized if he played. But, I think that, that also was something that, Chuck Noll brought in, was that, not just the trapping game and stuff like that, but having smart players, all across the field. And I think you saw that with other coaches. Bill Parcells was a big believer in that, having smart guys who knew what they were doing, when it came game time. And it, I think a lot of the other Steelers, they would say that, Chuck Noll wasn't a rah-rah guy. He expected his guys to be professionals and stuff like that. And I thought you saw that with other successful coaches of that era, Bill Walsh, Bill Parcells, Belichick, those guys were not, rah, get in your face and try to pump everybody up. Like some people would think they were guys who expected people to know their position and play the game smart. And that's what happened. And I think that Dad, for the offensive line, really represented that, the same way kind of Johnny Unitas, showed that as a quarterback, being the first quarterback who really, if you watch him, I of course, I'm too young to have ever said I saw Johnny Unitas play, but he was the first guy from what I've heard that, really called out, changed plays at the line, called audibles, stuff like that. And then you saw that with Joe Montana, and then, with Dan Marino and stuff like that as it went on and on and on. You saw that stuff start with those guys. And I think Dad was the guy for the line anyways, that really, became that guy, that focal point that people said, okay, this is what we can do with this position more than what we just did before.
Oh, I totally agree. And there was your dad, and then there was John Kolb. And those two together, you just knew you're going to be able to run the ball. You knew that, and you talk about traps, and you talk about just kind of, stunts and everything else that you could do on the line, just some great stuff. And the angle blocking that they would take, and then they just drive people, just sled them out like they're on skates. They turned people, and, and whatever moderate success I was able to have playing low-level college football, I would turn people. And I learned that.
Well, I think one of the biggest things with offensive linemen is, and it was something that, I was talking about somebody the other day, because they talked about Zach Frazier. And, they said, okay, here's another great, hopefully, knock on wood, another great Steelers center. And, I thought about, Marquise Pouncey, who was, the last real center there for 10 years. He was such an athlete. And this isn't to knock him. I thought he was a great center. I thought he was much more in the Dermontti Dawson athletic, but I said, with Dad, I think, and I think he got this from, and also, let's be honest, the time period that he, you played and stuff like that, it was a much different, you really had to learn the fundamentals. You really had to, now it's, and this isn't a knock on guys. Now, if a guy's so physically talented, guys maybe let him skate on, some of the fundamentals and stuff like that. And I think that's also why you see a lot of guys that when they get older, their careers maybe don't last as long as they should. Because they don't, have that baseline of fundamentals built into them. But I think that, with that, I said he's a professional center, and Zach Frazier and Dermontti Dawson, whereas, Marquise Pouncey was much more, I said he's like a jungle cat, he's just big and he's athletic and he can run and you could do all these things and stuff like that. And sometimes some of those guys, there's only their minds work a certain way. And if you try to overload them with fundamentals and stuff, you take something, because I know, in looking back at my career when I played, I was never, I didn't have the love of the game my dad had. I didn't have the love of fundamentals and stuff like that. The way my mind worked was, if but I also knew that's how you should play the game. So when I played, I could never relax and just play. And I knew that if I could go back and if there's anything I could tell myself would be to not worry about the fundamentals, just go out and just play. And there's some guys that are like that, Lawrence Taylor, or Jack Lambert or something like that. Those were guys you just could just go, Troy Polamalu, right. For or another reference to Steeler fans. And, there's a ton of guys for, the Giants and stuff like that, or any of these teams you can go out and mention that you just had to go out there and let them do whatever they wanted to do. And somehow, Ronnie Lott, right. That was a great example of guys that you could just say, just go do things and they're fine. And, I think with Pouncey, I'm not saying that he didn't have the ability to do those things, but maybe, and this would be my guess, is they said, he's a guy that he's got enough to worry about being the center, calling out the blitzes, right. Calling out other stuff. Just let him play the game. And I think that with Dad and some of these guys, and I think that generation of linemen that came in that mid 70s, especially with the advent of TV and people being able to actually watch the games. And I think also, John Madden, when he got into the booth and he was very good at, taking that coach's view of games, that you hear from people all the time say, they watched with John Madden, he would, use the telestrator and stuff. And I think that you saw the art of being a lineman and that skill. And like you said, turning people, hitting them at angles, using leverage. I think that's something that people didn't think of. And especially, back before the 70s, when primarily the game was on the radio, right. There was no way to appreciate that. Even now you can, and even, the Steelers, they have Craig Wolfley, who is a guard with the Steelers. My dad, he does a lot of the radio coverage, and he'll try to point out somebody making a great block or something like that. And you can't get that across on the radio, no matter how, even if you have the best radio commentator in the world, you're not going to get that across. But if you're on TV, you can see that stuff. And I think that Dad was, especially with the Steelers being on TV so much, because they've always been a good, big draw and stuff like that. I think that the Steelers got that across. And I think that even if, you look at other guys, played for the Giants, Bart Oates, Kevin Mawai.
Oh, okay. Bart Oates, so underappreciated.
Another great example is Dwight Stevenson, who was the center for the Dolphins.
Miami. Yep.
And I remember my dad telling me that he was the best athlete he ever saw an offensive line. And I think that with Dwight, I think what my dad was saying is that he's a guy who, like I was saying earlier, who didn't necessarily have to learn the fundamentals and make it such a succinct part of his repertoire, his skills and stuff like that, because he was so athletic and he was so good. And Dad would say, he could do stuff on the line I could never do, and that's why I had to learn the line. And the fun thing about sports is there's pluses and minuses to both. You see a guy in baseball, you see a guy who says, well, I'm going to try to be a contact hitter, and he hits for a higher than average but less home runs. And another guy will say, I'm hitting for home runs, and the next year he drops his batting average by 30 points, but he hits 20 more homers. Where's the trade-off? And, I think that, that was, part of the thing that Dad installed. And it was, obviously there were other people who were doing it too, but for whatever reason, Dad was the guy who was really noticed for that. And I think that's a really cool thing to be a part of, to make people appreciate another aspect of the game.
Was your dad aware of the fact that he was revered for changing the position and the respect for the position? Some of the stuff you and I talk about now, it's a lot easy, no pun intended, Monday morning quarterback. But was he aware that
I think that, with my dad is he was very uncomfortable with personal, attention and adulation and stuff like that. He definitely had his pride, and he had a very self-deprecating way about him when he played and stuff like that. I think that he also was a very focused, individual. And there's one audio clip that I've heard from him where he talks about how when things are going on, he didn't really realize it because the intense constant, that was always thing he would always tell me when I played, for a couple of years there right before he passed away. And he would talk to me about concentration and, stuff like that. And I don't think he ever really understood. And especially with the way we kind of moved around, when he ended his career in Pittsburgh, we moved away, we moved to Kansas City, and then he played 2 more years there, and then we moved to Wisconsin. So he wasn't in the Pittsburgh area where, he was, it still is to this day, such a, big, even I get uncomfortable talking about it. Because to me, he was just Dad. He wasn't, Hall of Fame center and stuff like that. But, he wasn't comfortable with that. And he didn't have the, kind of way to step back and look and realize. I mean, I think he, especially from other players and his peers, I think he really appreciated when they would point out their respect for his technique or his respect for what he did or something like that. But I think for him, he was so intensely focused on his work and his craft that he didn't notice it. And I think it's something similar to, if you talk to anyone who's really great at their job and really enjoys it, and it's an all-consuming job, whether you're talking about being a construction worker, a craftsman, somebody in the military who really loves being a fighter pilot, they will say, I didn't notice the great, flight I did, or the great piece of furniture I made, or the great, police work I did to crack that case. You're so into it. And I think we all have that experience in our lives with something. It's like, you sit back and watch football, or you whatever your favorite pastime is, and all of a sudden you look up at the clock and it's 6 hours later, and you're like, where the hell did the time go?
A YouTube rabbit hole, like you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Yeah. You go down, you start watching videos of stuff you like on YouTube, or reading an article, and it's something you're really interested in. And I think it's like that, just in a different aspect, with a different type of, multiplication factor, where you don't understand where the time's going, or the people who appreciate you, or whatever. And I think truthfully, you really know you've done something well if you don't know that people appreciate what you're doing. If you do something bad, you'll know. But if you do something really well, that self-satisfaction comes before anybody, even though it's always nice to get your kudos and stuff like that. I think everybody has their own way of getting their satisfaction from their job. And I think that's what my dad took from it. I don't think it was the Super Bowl rings. I know that. I think what mattered most to my dad was being out there every play and playing. And I posted on social media, the only personal accomplishment I ever remember him really bragging about was snapping for regular plays, punts, and field goals for, I think it was 6 straight years without missing a snap. And for him, I think that's because that showed that he was basically doing the job that, that's what it was. And he could do those parts of the job there. It's not like now where you have a guy who just long snaps and that's all he does. Right. And he does that for 3-4 times a game, and then he's done. And I think for him, that's what he took as being his proudest accomplishment, because that represented all that work. If you put in all that work and you do all 3 things, you're golden.
Why am I not surprised that that's what he was most proud of? I mean, he always had this very organic vibe of just being a lunch pail guy. Let's go to work. Let's just take pride in what we do, and let's move on. That's great.
Well, I think he was, I've always thought that, if Dad wouldn't have gone into the football and it wouldn't have worked out for him, I think he would have been great in the armed services in some way. That repetition, that, honing your craft and being good at it. I think, and just enjoying that day to day, whatever it is. I think that's what he loved about it, and I think that's what, despite, how everything went and, all the, let's just say, difficulties we had past football. I think the biggest thing that he enjoyed, and when you play team sports or any kind of sport, really, there's always something about, like, for me, the thing I always loved about playing football was hanging with the guys, and that feeling of being on a team, and that feeling with being with your teammates and having fun with them and winning and losing. And I think that's it for a lot of people. I think with Dad, he did enjoy that. He enjoyed winning, and he enjoyed feeling like he was a reason for that winning in a way where he did his job, and I think that's the thing with a lot of the modern athletes today, especially, you see this with wide receivers and quarterbacks, where they complain about things and people think, oh, they're being selfish. I think what it really is they don't want to be the reason the team loses. And they want to, when they see their team doing well, they want to be, and I think that's a great thing. They want to be one of the reasons that team's winning. I'm sure back when you played in college, granted, you wanted your team to win, but even more than you wanting your team to win, you wanted them to win. You wanted to be an integral part of them winning.
Right.
And I think the great thing about a coach is, and I think this is something Chuck Noll understood, is understanding that and harnessing that and realizing that that's not a selfish, that's not anti-team. That's the most team thing you could want to be, Right. And I think that you look at any successful team, you look at the Bill Parcells teams, you look at the 49ers teams, Bill Walsh, the Chicago Bulls teams, with Michael Jordan, or with Shaquille O'Neal and the Lakers. Those other players, they knew Michael Jordan was the star. They wanted to do what their job was. And they wanted to know they contributed to that, whether it was a defensive stopper or getting a sack on the quarterback or getting that big hit. that's what my dad wanted, and that's what he took pride in more than anything.
A different sport, but John Wooden, the coach John Wooden, very famously said, the score will take care of itself. You do your job, focus on what
Mhm.
your responsibility is. The rest takes care of itself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's, in a perfect world, the playoffs or the championships where everything comes together, but it's not going to get there without doing those things throughout the
Mhm.
season and doing them in practice and doing them and overall doing them as often and as with as much repetition as you can. Anybody can make one good block or one good sack or one good
Yep.
hit. They need to be able to do that in a consistent time and do that well. And I think that's what my dad. Everybody would hear about his work ethic and stuff like that. That's what it was about for him. Was doing it time after time after time, and being able to do it.
So I want to ask some questions about your dad post career, real before
Mm-hmm.
we end. But I want to ask you. I've talked to a few um, children of professional athletes before. Do you feel pressure playing the sport and having to live up to? I mean, that's a big shadow. I've talked to some people who say it didn't bother them. I've talked to some people that, in retrospect, I wish they handled it differently. How was it for you, if I may ask?
Well, for me, I think that there's kind of a bunch of answers to that question. Because like I said, when my dad's post career, I didn't grow up in Pittsburgh.
Right.
I did not know my dad was a big deal in Pittsburgh really until I moved out here. Even when he got into the Hall of Fame in '97, that was the first time it ever really hit me that my dad played football. Because we left Kansas City and they loved him in Kansas City. We loved our time
Yeah.
in Kansas City, but we moved back to Wisconsin. He really wasn't a big deal. And if anything, in Wisconsin, they pretty much looked at him, well, you're this big football player. Why are you back here? That it was almost like they thought that my dad was mocking them or
Mm.
something like that, which was, asinine because my dad was from Wisconsin. And when I was in Wisconsin, I loved basketball. That was a sport I loved. And I can look back and say, I think some of that was, as a kid, I think you always, regardless of what your parents do, you always want to kind of set your own path, whether it's
Sure.
the rebellious streak or, your parents like this kind of music, you want to like the other kind of music just to piss them off, And I think that when I moved out here to Pittsburgh, because playing football was something I wanted to do. And I did play football. I did, but basketball was what I loved. And when I came out here and I played, it hit me. And at the time I thought I was ready for it, but I can look back now and say I wasn't. I didn't have that maturity that, if I would have grown up out here and stayed here, I think my personal, I don't want to say career, because I think that because you're still very lucky if you could make it to college or, I think you got to make it to at least a college to say it's a career. But, let's see, my playing time could have been a lot more productive if I would have had that maturity and had that time out here to, not saying that to soak in that, oh, I'm Mike Webster's son or something like that, but to really enjoy, because I think that when I came out here and I saw what a big deal dad was, it kind of overwhelmed me in that aspect of, you're a 15, 16-year-old. You'd lie if you were not going to say you're going to get a little bit of a big head
Of course.
from that. But also I think that I wasn't able to carve out what my lane was, my path and stuff like that. And I think my dad, I say this a lot, is my dad really didn't encourage me too much to play football. And it wasn't necessarily any, he was worried about my health or he didn't believe in me and stuff like that. It was because he wanted me to do my own thing, and he wanted me to not, he was, even though my dad was, like I said, he didn't court public attention or he didn't, wasn't a look at me guy in any kind of a way. He still knew that me being out here and stuff like that. And I think my dad, in a way, did want me to experience that. I think that was, it's kind of like, if you take your son to your job, you want people around to say nice things about you,
Sure.
You want to show off, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's how it should be.
Right.
But I think he knew that I don't want to say wasn't ready, but I don't think my dad at that point in time had the capacity emotionally or mentally to really speak to me. And, again, my dad was just like you were guys who grew up in the 50s and 60s, emotions were not things, he talked about and stuff like that.
Not at all.
Even father to son, that was not something you did.
No.
But I think that my dad didn't have the ability to sit down and really explain to me why he maybe wasn't encouraging me. And for me, even there was part of me that kind of wondered why he wasn't encouraging me. And I can look now past as the years have passed, my dad's passed away. I realized what he was doing was giving me the chance to, if I didn't like football, which how it ended up, me not realizing this isn't what I wanted to do, I wouldn't feel bad. I wouldn't beat myself up and feel like a failure. I definitely wish my career would have gone differently and I would have put more into it than I did, and taken it more seriously. But I don't look at it as like, oh, I'm a failure because I didn't, like, I'm Mike Webster's son. I didn't amount to anything as a football player. I don't have that issue or complex or anything like that. And a lot of that is because of who my dad and my parents were. They didn't make me feel like that's what I had to do. And that's something that I didn't understand at the time, but I understand now.
Yeah, I was going to say, it
And
sounds to me like you had some pretty darn good parents in terms of allow you to do you.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
And I think every kid should have that, every kid,
me too.
regardless of who your dad is. And I think that most of the time, and I think this is something that I heard, I believe it was Reggie. I've always tried to find out who said the quote, because I just remember that it was on one of those pregame shows that I was watching, because I'm a huge sports fan, and especially back in, the late '90s, I was a huge Kansas City Chiefs fan. They were my favorite
Sure.
team because I remember my dad playing for Kansas City,
Mm-hmm.
and I was a big Joe Montana fan. I remember, to me, I never thought of my dad even playing football, and one of the reasons was because, excuse me, was because, like I said, I thought it was Reggie White's kid who said to us, he's not 15-time All Pro, greatest defender of all time. He's just dad.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, I don't know, get something in my throat here. And for me, that's what I looked at, is he was just dad. So it didn't even register to me, oh, Mike Webster's famous, football player. Everybody knows him, blah, 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 blah. It was just, oh, that's what he did. It's no big deal, stuff like that. And part of that is difficult because, especially with how things ended, I wish I would have had a chance to really talk to him about those good times, and really, because I think also he got, and I think any athlete or any career you have, when you retire and you start getting that space away, you want to look back and say, especially those closest to you, that's when you kind of want them to come up and say, hey, you were a big deal, And I think that dad, especially at the end of his life, needed that boost at times, but he had so far withdrawn himself from everything else that he could have had it if he wanted, but he also, like I said, he didn't have that personality to seek it out and stuff like that. And I think that, for me and for a lot of the other kids, and I don't think it's, and this is not saying it against people who grow up thinking, oh, my dad's Deion Sanders or my dad's, Michael Jordan or whatever. I grew up with the point that my dad is just this guy. This is what he did for a few years. And especially this was before the age of being able to watch every NFL game on my phone in 10 minutes. If I get on the phone right now, it's still crazy to me that I can go out back and watch a preseason game from the Steelers from 1976, on YouTube. But, back then, you didn't see those highlights, and stuff like that. So there's a good chance my dad could have convinced me that he never played football at all if he really tried. But, that's how I grew up. And I think that, and I'm glad too, because I would never want to grow up arrogant or wanted to grow up as, expecting things or something like that out of life, and I'm glad my dad raised me and my mom raised me that way, to really kind of, there's definitely obviously been some emotional issues because of how everything went.
Sure.
But overall, I'd say, I love who my parents were. I'm happy with, the life I had with them, and growing up and stuff. I had great memories. And I think a lot of that is because how us kids were raised with that humility and not walking around with that big, chip or even our own expectations, of, oh, I have to be a football player to be, because my dad was this Hall of Famer, and I think you see a lot of players whose fathers are players, every once in a while, you see the ones who, go on and do really well, LeBron James and his son, or there's another one right now that's blanking on me completely, do well and play, Ken Griffey Jr. and his Ken Griffey Sr., But I think you see a lot more of them. They get to a certain point and they just kind of say, you know what, I kind of want to do my own thing.
Sure.
And that's how, I looked at it with my dad. I'm glad of that, even though at the time maybe it was difficult for me, but right now I'm glad of that.
So post-career, we know about the situations and people can look into all that. it had to be tough. Hopefully, the changes have been made, because I truly believe that the sacrifice that your dad went through, and just the way he lived his life and the legacy, that will be changes to save other people's lives from going through what he had to go through and went through. Um, and I get emotional about it still because of some of the nonprofit stuff I've done with the people that go through it. It's even toward the end, did your dad realize how many people loved him?
Yeah, I think the one thing in a very weird way is, my dad, after passing away, has this legacy, this kind of post legacy that's just as important as his playing legacy. And I think the really cool thing, the thing that I really like about it, is that it's helped people outside of football players. And I'm not saying that football players don't need help and stuff like that, but and it goes to not just concussions, but mental health. It goes to things like, addiction, or, suicidal thoughts, depression, stuff like that, homelessness, and I think the thing is that we as a country have made, and not just our country, I guess you could say the whole world has made so many amazing medical advances in the last 50 years. And, I was watching something the other day where they are now doing implants for kids who are blind or born blind, who can, they put in computer chips and stuff and they can actually see and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those things are amazing. But the human brain is one of those things that, and mental health is one of those things that you can't really see and diagnose. You can't, if somebody has a broken leg, you can see it. If somebody has a amputated arm, you can see it. If somebody's wasting away from cancer, you can see it. And I think that with mental health issues or concussions or brain injuries, whatever you want to call it, and obviously they're all different, but they're all sort of generate in that same kind of area. And I think addiction too with this, because I think you see a lot of people who have, mental health issues or traumatic brain injuries, and I think that if my dad, being a sports player, and being a famous sports player, and his story for whatever reason, whether it's because of the whole, everything that went into it, the team that he was on, whatever you want to call it, because that Steelers team of the 70s was the first real super team. Really, there was the Green Bay Packers, who won, I don't even know how many championships, but that was before the age of TV and stuff like that. And of course, you had the New York Yankees winning their championships and stuff. But I think the Steeler team was such a big deal. The 4 black men on the cover of Time magazine for the Steel Curtain. How big of a deal that was.
Oh, huge.
I think that if all that stuff goes and helps, because my dad did a lot of work with charities and with nonprofits for spina bifida, for rehabilitation after jail and stuff like that. If that stuff, that's a really cool legacy. And that's one of the biggest things I really wish my dad would have lived to see that aspect. Because I think every athlete goes through, even if you just play high school football, you go to that point where you say, oh man, I gave up all this stuff and all I did was play high school football. Is you do get that part of you that does think, oh, because on some level, it's just a game. Mm-hmm. And I think that, with a lot of the athletes, and I think you see with the athletes who struggle, they retire because they're incredibly talented people, incredibly hard work. You can't be I know people like to think the big dumb jock, but if you see the amount of especially the kids who are playing today, that was my biggest thing when I got to college and I saw how much these kids, they expected you to do every day. And this was 20 years ago. I can't imagine what they expect them to do now. It was just overwhelming. You're not going to be a success at any of those things. You be in the Army, whatever, without having some capability to do something else great in life. And I do think there's some part of that they hit and they say, okay, well, this is, all I did was win some games and win a championship, which is great. But also I want to do a little more, and my dad was one of those people, he wanted to do something more than football. And some of that also is part of also with mental health is teaching them to be happy in life and what you accomplish and stuff like that. And to realize that, as cheesy as it sounds, you're enough. And I think that's what led to a lot of my dad's financial issues and stuff like that, trying to start businesses and stuff like that, was trying to do something outside of football. And I think if he would have understood that, the brain injury stuff and the concussion stuff, all that stuff has helped so many people that goes beyond winning a game or doing something like that, or even making the game safer for the players. You watch the game now, regardless of, and I do think they should obviously do more, and again, like going back to what I said, with a human brain, there's only so much you can really diagnose. There's a reason why I don't know if my dad ever suffered an actual completely and utterly legitimate concussion, but my dad suffered tons of subconcussive blows to the head. And that's something that gets lost.
Repetitive blows.
Exactly. Is that you'll see people say, oh, well, he didn't get hit that hard, and I do think the biggest thing that was underestimated is how much fans care about the players. And I've been in plenty of sports bars watching games, been at games and stuff like that. And, you'll still see people, there's a big hit on the field and stuff, and they'll say, oh, what a hit, that guy, knock him out of the game. But generally, if they know the guy really has a concussion, you'll always see it. Now, how many times have you watched a game where somebody gets a real concussion, the whole place goes dead silent because they know it's something serious? And I think fans have always, for as much as people like to say, oh, they watch football for the bloodlust and stuff, I don't think I've never thought that that's why people watch the game.
I agree.
And I think that seeing these things and stuff like that, but you watch players now, you can tell the announcers are more cognizant. Even if it's a little bit, the league is more cognizant. They see these players like that. They've seen, you see them wearing those kind of funny shells on their helmets, even though I think there's only a few players that wear them. I've read things where those have reduced concussions hugely for, players that wear this helmet. And maybe that's the way, that things will go. Maybe that, that's one of the things they'll mandate, say, hey, these guys got to wear them, or at least give them the option to wear them, which, they have, as I said, because you've seen players wearing the helmets. That to me is from a sports aspect, it's a great thing. And then you go on to, like I said, the mental health, the addictions, the regular person that was in a 10-mile-an-hour car accident who is never the same again. If my dad's sacrifice, whatever you want to call it, can help people, I think that just adds to his legacy and makes me more proud as a son of him.
Oh, well, it has helped people. And I this is about your dad, but I'll give you a great example. My son played, junior hockey, played travel hockey, and in the state of California, they won a state championship. And I bring that up only because.
No way, they have hockey in California?
Oh, yeah.
What, sitting on the beach isn't good enough for them?
Well, not a lot of beach in Fresno.
They realize. Oh, well, all right, I'll give you that.
Well, anyway, yeah, they did, and which is great. And you learn so many things about working hard and this and that. But 3 concussions in, I think of people like your dad.
Yeah.
And he plays beer league hockey now.
Yeah.
But and that's enough.
As a guy, if we get crippled doing something stupid like beer league hockey or frisbee golf, that's our destiny. Okay, that's totally fine and understandable.
Right.
All right, we all can live with that. Okay.
Yep.
But no, and I think that's you see with the quarterback for the Dolphins, is
Tua,
look at the massive amount of people talking about his future, and it comes from a good place. Does it maybe come a little overboard at certain points in time? But I don't think I've read one article online where it's Tua, and I always say his last name wrong, so I'm just going to call him Tua.
Same here. I'm from Brooklyn.
Yeah. I haven't seen one article that says he's a giant pansy and he should get out there.
No.
If you wind the clock back 20 years ago, and this was John Elway, Phil Simms, Brett Favre with a concussion, they would say he's a giant pussy. He needs to get out there and sacrifice for his team. Nobody's saying that now, and I think that is a great thing. And I think not just with football, I think you see it in other aspects of life too. You see, because I've always compared brain injuries to, and I'm not a medical professional, but this is the way I've always seen it, is that it's the closest thing you can relate head injuries with is somebody with an addiction problem, because there's parts of you, when somebody who has addiction problem, there's the human thing is you're going to see somebody you love and you're going to think that you want them to get better. So you see them for a day or two and they're looking better and you think, okay, this is the turnaround, they're going to get better now. And I think that when you know somebody with addiction, they'll have days where they're totally functional. Then oh my God, he's better than ever. He can't really have an addiction problem. He's fine. And then of course the other 29 days, they're a mess. And you don't see that physical downgrade. I think that, you look at, somebody with cancer, you see them slowly start to waste away. Now, granted, obviously people could beat cancer and they have beaten cancer, but usually then if they start getting back to strength and stuff like that, you can say, okay, they are actually getting better now. But the way a addiction or someone with severe depression can hide that from the people around them is the same way somebody with traumatic brain injury can either hide it, or they can, without even knowing it, mask it. They can, like I said with my dad, he shut himself off from a lot of people who could have helped him by, not wanting people to see, like you talked about, the pride everybody talks about him being Iron Mike, that was its own curse too.
Sure.
I think that, not that my dad was, oh, I'm Iron Mike, I can't show it. It was more of, I want people to remember me, this guy who could do that job, who could snap for 6 straight years, punts and field goals and stuff like that. It was, okay, so if I can't show them that, I'm going to shut myself off from them, whether it's purposely being mean to them or being nasty to them, or just, of course, this was back really before cell phones, just not answering their phone calls and sleeping at truck stops and stuff like that so they don't see me. And I think that's the way my dad went about it. And I think just like you'll see people who are really struggling with depression or addiction or head injuries, they shut themselves because they don't understand what's going on with them. I think with my dad, he didn't understand what was going on with them. And even if they do, they think, okay, I can get better. I'll shut myself out for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and then I'll start getting better. And I think that, and especially with athletes, I think all athletes have that. Even I haven't played any organized sport in 20 years. I still have if I'm not feeling good one day or my ankle hurts one day, it's not, oh, I need to go to the doctor. It's, I'll be fine in a day or so. Give me 25 ibuprofen and 6 Tylenol. I'm good.
Ready to go.
Ready to roll. And I think that is something that is changing in our society. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Oh, no, I do too. And one thing before I go, and then I have one kind of fun question for you. I was talking to a couple of former NFL players and one NHL player who said the same thing. Now, they played in the 90s, so 80, 90s, sort of a bridge right after your dad and before kind of the modern athlete now. And they were able to see the big change start to occur to help the athlete post-career. Like when they came into the league, the people coming out, there was nothing. Hey, good luck. Go find a job. Go deal with what it's like after 20 years, everybody throwing flowers your way that you're the greatest thing. Now who are you?
Yeah.
That the mental health that's out there now from teams, just out there with agreements and contracts, is so much better than it was back then.
Yeah. Well, I think the perfect example of this, I always like to say, it's like therapy. If you went back 20 years ago I remember Alex Rodriguez, and say what you want about Alex Rodriguez a bunch of different ways. I remember before one of his seasons that he won the MVP for the Yankees. Of course, I was a Yankees fan, so I remember Alex Rodriguez's relationship with the fans in New York. But I remember I think it was before his second season, came out and said he was in therapy. And I remember there being a huge, I knew he was a pussy and all this other kind of stuff. And now it's in a situation where if somebody says they're in therapy or somebody says, people are more, look at Antonio Brown. If he said he was in therapy, people would say, oh, thank God.
Yep. No, that's a great point.
Stuff like that. Or you see guys, and I think that's where that mental health aspect, or that kind of that stigma, that post-retirement, like I even said, with Dad, we always thought his issues, especially after he retired immediately, we thought it was, okay, here's a guy who was obsessive about practice, about training, about doing, and now all of a sudden he's done and he has nothing to do. And my dad, he loved being around the kids, but you can't take somebody like that and expect them to just be happy sitting at home doing anything. And it doesn't matter what it is. And, we thought, well, one day he's just going to wake up and he's going to find something to put his energy to, and he's going to be 100% better. That's what this is. That's what we thought it was for the longest time. And I think that, there was a weird period between when every team started getting free agency and you started seeing the salaries for all these players go. Because at the end of the day, as callous as it is to say, money is a huge aspect in this.
Oh, 100%.
And you go to guys who, my dad's biggest salary he made was with the Kansas City Chiefs his last 2 years, and he made more in one season than he did his entire career with Pittsburgh.
Wow.
And you all of a sudden go from, okay, well, Mike Webster, one of the greatest, blah 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 of all time, and all this. All of a sudden, he retires, and okay, Joe Montana, yeah, he makes money, but he's got endorsements, he's got this, he's got stocks things, all these other kinds of things, and he's got people that are going to protect him from doing something stupid with his money or something like that. But you go to these linemen, or you go to the second tier guy on the Giants, or you go to some guy who's played, for the Kings on his fourth line or something like that. They have no idea. There's nobody there to help. There's nobody, and if you go and you read back these stories for teams in the 70s and 80s or before my dad, it was, okay, he's retired. It was very much a employee-employer relationship. It was, thank you for your service. Good luck. Maybe we'll throw some autograph shows your way, or, best case scenario, one of the owners helps get you a job at some plant or something like that, or selling cars at a car dealership. That was that weird period there in the 90s where there's this huge group of guys that didn't make enough to really support themselves throughout their career. And this goes from being, the amount of work these guys put in even a 5-year career is as much physical labor and stuff like that as somebody who works in, let's say you work at a plant that builds cars. You can do that same amount of work, but you're going to do it over 60 years, earning a pension, earning, benefits, earning a salary. So when you retire, you're closer to that point where you don't care. You've settled down enough where you're fine with sitting on the porch and having a beer every night, and fishing off the dock and stuff like that. When these athletes retired, they're in their mid-30s, they're still in the prime of their life, and they've got all this, okay, I'm used to doing this every single week. And I think there was that period where a lot of players got lost in the shuffle of that happening. And I think that it was, and also, like I just talked about with therapy, our society didn't know how to deal with those guys either. It was, well, you played football, so you should be rich. You should be not just rich, but you should have enough money to go settle any problems you have. You know what I mean? If you've got some issues or something like that. And it wasn't there. And I think people now understand that. And I think you see not just players, but owners and fans and stuff like that understand, holy crap, this guy needs help. This guy who does this stuff, he needs a hand. Now, granted, a lot of the guys now, they make so much money that almost when they retire, they can immediately start going into treatment. They can have things locked, put away from, like my dad always said to me that he wasn't mad about the injuries he received during playing football. He was mad that when the game was over, there was nothing there for him. There was no, the Players Association even fought against dad getting his pension. Like, we don't receive a pension right now from my dad and stuff like that.
That's ridiculous.
So, we don't receive a pension. We don't receive any benefits, anything. And, those guys and stuff like that, there was no program. There was no anything, stuff like that. There was just sit around and wait, and I think that's the really difficult part. And our society didn't, just like I talked about with Alex Rodriguez, and this was only 20 years ago, didn't know dealing with some guy going into therapy. And let's be real here, you're a massive athlete. That's one of the highest paid, playing for the most famous franchise in the world, the Yankees. You have, and I mean, obviously A-Rod brought a lot of problems on himself, but he also was doing amazing things and was still getting booed out of the stadium every night. And if there was ever a guy, you want to see a guy that wants to be loved, watch A-Rod for his first couple of years in the Yankees.
Oh, yeah.
And granted, that's annoying sometimes,
right.
But it's also, I mean, that's what you should want, and, this was 20 years ago. It was boo him and think he's terrible for doing this to try to give himself a better life. Even if you want to look at it as being better for our team, it was, oh, he's a pansy. Now it's, if a guy like, I don't know who the modern A-Rod would be, probably Travis Kelce or something like that. But, you would, if Patrick Mahomes came out tomorrow afternoon and said, I'm in therapy for just some things that I'm going through. So people would say, that's great. That's a very brave thing. Let's get him an endorsement deal. Let's raise awareness for this. That's not how things work. And especially you go back, 10 more years when it's an offensive lineman, it's, we don't want to think of, and I think a lot of people knew that people from my dad's generation were going to be struggling when they retired. And I don't think they knew exactly what it was. I don't think they because again, like I said, with a human brain, you can't sit, if my dad would have retired with two broken legs that were Joe Theismann legs, sticking out 8 different ways, I think people would have made sure he had his pension, made sure he had help, all this other kind of stuff. But you can't see that, because the other thing too is you don't want to view him and think this is what's going to happen to me. And I think that, after my dad retired, we didn't hear, to this day, we really don't hear from any of my dad's teammates. We'll see him at events, and stuff like that, and they'll say nice things and stuff like that. But I think they look at dad and they say, I think there's the guilt and the hurt of seeing your teammate who struggled so much after he retired, and that guilt of maybe we didn't reach out like we should. Maybe we didn't help him when we could have helped him. But I think there's also a bigger part that's, could what happened to Mike Webster happen to me? Am I going to wake up one day and not understand how to do basic finance? Am I going to blow all my family's money? Am I going to, is my marriage going to be destroyed? Is my relationship with my kids, am I going to end up sleeping at a truck stop? And those are very believable. I mean, those are complete. When I say that, I'm not saying that where I say, oh, I'm mad at Terry Bradshaw. I'm mad, that I haven't heard from Jack Lambert or Lynn Swan, or they haven't offered us money. I'm saying that I understand where they're coming from with that. And I think there's still that sect there, those guys that I talked about from the 70s and 80s and 90s, that small part that I talked about, those guys in the, pretty much retired in the 90s to the early 2000s, they're still there and they're still struggling. And I do think now they've gotten better at reaching out. I know the Steelers have gotten much better at reaching out to guys and trying to get them help and finding ways to communicate with these guys so they don't feel like it's charity and stuff like that, because they have their pride. And I don't think anyone has the right to take away somebody's pride. And not saying that offering somebody charity is taking away their pride.
No,
but
that's called grace. That's called grace.
But I still think you do know that, especially with us guys, it's that's how you take it as that person.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
And I think that is, the issue with a lot of these guys. And I think that everybody's gotten better at reaching out with them and helping them out and saying, this is what can we do to make things better for you. So because you don't nobody deserves to struggle, but especially, nobody wants to see their heroes struggle.
No.
And I think that's something that's changed. And that's another thing that I'm glad that dad was a part of, and his story changed.
I bring this up quickly because it was said on my podcast. And if I get a couple of the facts a little wrong, so be it, but the dates. But I had a former NHL player, also a friend, Kevin Kaminsky, on.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how, and he was a fighter. His job for the Washington Capitals was to fight. And he was maybe 5'10". So he was punching up the whole thing. He was taking blows at every game. So I think it's 4 years. It could be 5 years. The number of games that you have to play to get a pension.
Mm-hmm.
So the year that he was going to get a pension, he gets injured, and then they go on strike. Now, the strike didn't count toward the pension time.
Mm-hmm.
Never got his job back. Done.
Yeah.
And there was nothing in the 90s. What you're talking about.
I think it's one of those things that when I talk about how the strides we've made, there's also strides where we're not there yet, and I think that we still at times put too much of an emphasis on profit and not enough about caring with these people and doing what's best for them, and realizing too that there's families attached to these guys. If you pay attention to baseball at all, you saw what happened with the Pirates. They just had a guy who was 4 at-bats away from earning a $200,000 bonus. Now, granted that, that guy, that $200,000 bonus would have been more than 3/4 of my dad's career in earnings. Right. And I'm not talking, it's just the simple principle of the matter. Yep. Is that this is a guy that came into your team, played all year, was, by all accounts, being from Pittsburgh, I've never heard a bad thing or a bad report. He struggled hitting a fastball for, May and June and stuff like that. But it's like, if you want to show what you're thought of and stuff like that, I mean, how ridiculous is that? It's one thing I've said, and I'll say this again, and I'm not somebody who thinks that the government should regulate everything we do or anything like that. But there needs to be a department in the government that regulates certain things when it comes to sports, with how big of a business sports is.
I totally agree.
The things that the owners and, again, you got the Pirates. This is a guy who bought the team, doesn't do anything with it, doesn't improve it, doesn't and they're getting tax money to pay for their stadium.
Yep.
There should be, and Pittsburgh's a baseball town. If you go back and watch when the Pirates had that little run where they made the playoffs for 3 or 4 straight years, and watch there's a one home game where you're telling me that's not one of the best atmospheres you've ever seen at a baseball game.
A beautiful stadium.
And the owner, if the owner's sitting there crying poverty, he either needs to sell the team or something, but he's also getting probably $100 million a year just from revenue sharing from the teams. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely, with how important sports is and how much of our society takes cues from sports, there needs to be somebody out there who's not, because you'll say, oh, well, there's a commissioner, but they've made it clear in every sport the commissioner's on the side of the owners.
100%.
There's baseball is probably the only players union that can stand up to the owners and say, I remember there was a hearing once, because the whole thing with my dad's story started with a discussion on players' rights and players' post-retirement careers and their benefits and stuff like that. And there was a hearing at Capitol Hill that I was invited to and I spoke at. And one of the senators said, Mike Webster, Cal Ripken Jr., 2 very similar guys, all-time greats, quote unquote, Iron Men of their sport. Here's what Cal Ripken Jr. gets. Not just him gets, but his family will get, his kids will get, his vesting options. Here's what Mike Webster gets: 0. And he had to fight for, it took us until 4 years after my dad's death for us to get anything of his benefits. And the only thing the NFL the Players Association could say, well, we have $13 billion in our fund in our retirement fund, but there's only $100 million going out every year. Less than what they were making in interest was going out every year for players. And you're talking about the most violent league in the world.
Yep. And they appealed. They even appealed, correct?
They appealed, and the head of the Players Association, Gene Upsaw, said on the Supreme Court of Appeals that they wouldn't do anything different, and they feel bad, but they can't help out every player that needs help. And they pretty much said that what happened with my dad was his own fault. And
no.
But again, that's the normal thing. There was the concussion settlement, that my dad was cut out of. There were 4 guys that were cut out of the concussion settlement with their dates. And it was the first 4 NFL players that were diagnosed with this traumatic brain injury. And that's how things have been. But again, at the same time too, when they do that, it just makes the issue be longer and more prolonged for them. They have to deal with it longer, and that's, there's something when it comes to karma and whatever you want to call it. If you look at through history, the people who continuously screw people over, they eventually get theirs. The theory that, the bad guy, quote unquote, gets away. The bad guy in history has never, there's my golden. He's looking at you.
Yeah,
he wants to weigh in on the subject. But, these guys who do things and really take advantage and hurt people, they eventually have their comeuppance, whether it's, you look at the famous, look at the magnets from the 20s and 30s that were what they call newspaper magnets and stuff like that. They all eventually had their comeuppance. You look at some of the team owners that have really been scumbags, they eventually get what's coming to them. And, that's their own thing to deal with, but it's great to be able to say that my dad has a legacy that has helped a ton of people outside of sports and in sports too.
So my 2 fun questions before I let you go. And again, thank you so much for your time today, Garrett. And first is, you don't need to tell me what his answer was if he did answer this question. But did he ever give you his belief on the Immaculate Reception?
Well, the funny thing is, I used to think my dad was in that play. That was 2 years before he got drafted. But
but talking to the guys,
like I said, he told me that, he would always try to dodge the question, say he wasn't there, so he couldn't see, and also I think that even, at this point in time, it's even better that we don't totally know what happened. I will say
that's what Franco Harris says. It's best we don't know.
I will say that in the entire 50 some years since the Immaculate Reception, I've never seen a ball hit a shoulder pad and bounce that high and that far. That's all I'll say.
Right.
But like I said, it's 50 years after the thing. I don't know what God has against the Raiders. You look at that play, you look at Tom Brady's fumble. Granted, I hate the Raiders, and my dad used to say they were the dirtiest team in the league. So I think it's, and Al Davis was a prick, but I think that they probably get what they deserve there, so I'm not going to cry for them. But
Right. Yeah.
I think that's what, when you talk about the immaculate reception, I think it's even better that we don't everybody might know, but they don't know. It's like Babe Ruth's called shot. It's you can't totally say it.
Right. And the second one, I think you just answered. Your dad, I think, played against some of the most elite teams. What was the better team? Was it the Raiders or the Cowboys that he played against? But I think you probably just answered that question.
Well, he would always say the toughest team that he played against that I know he respected was the Oilers. That's who he talked about a lot.
Pastorini, Earl Campbell, that was a tough tough
well, remember,
team.
They were in the same division as
Yep.
Pittsburgh too during that. I don't know when because I know that, the NFL has done a bunch of different divisions, but they would play them pretty much every year. And also, I think they had 2 big playoff games against them.
Oh yeah, they did. Mike Renfro was actually in, and they called it out.
The ice bowl, or the slush bowl, I think is what they call it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, I think that the bigger rivalry was the Raiders, because especially, that first Super Bowl, having that game, and the story about, John Madden saying the 2 best teams just played, and Chuck Noll saying, no, the 2 best teams are playing this Sunday. And so, I know that, but I think with my dad, for him, it was more about what players he was playing against. And I know with the Cowboys, it was Randy White. He would talk about him being just so good, and Too Tall Jones and Hollywood Henderson and stuff like that. And then he would also talk about, like I said, Greg Bingham and some of the other players for the Oilers. For the Raiders, it was, Larry Azado and Howie Long. Those guys, were, the guys that he talked about the most, and being, and then of course, you got the Rams with Jack Youngblood and stuff like that. It was, I think that Dad liked those guys. Of course, the Giants too.
Right.
He really liked Mark Gastineau for the Jets. Huge fan 99. Of his. Yep. A big fan of his. He would talk about all those guys. And I think that, I know that probably that he knew that the most storied games they had were against the Raiders. But he would always tell me, he said everybody hates the Raiders. Fuck them. He'd say that every time. And he said the Cowboys, they played him in 2 Super Bowls, but he always thought they outclassed. They always talk about the drop touchdown pass by
Jackie Smith.
Jackie Smith in that Super Bowl. I said, they couldn't stop the Steelers. They couldn't stop the Steelers offense the whole game. And he would always say, and that drop was in the third quarter. That dropped. There was plenty of time for the Cowboys to rebound from that and score, and they never did. Right. I think that, but he admired a lot of players on their teams. Fran Tarkenton. Archie Manning was somebody he talked about all the time, being one of, because he was always on such crap teams. He would always say he was always on the worst teams. I remember Dad saying he was so good, but he was on just the worst teams. Yeah. And I think that was it. Poor Fran Tarkenton. Well, what did he go? 3 Super Bowls and lost them.
Yes, he did.
And it's just, it's kind of one of those things. And I think I think also with linemen too, I think they more of identify the players they played against rather than the teams they played against. True. I think when you get to quarterbacks and, defensive backs and stuff like that, I think, like, if you ask Deion Sanders, well, what's the best, he wouldn't say, oh, the best team we played against was X. He would say, oh, Jerry Rice. Right. If you asked Mel Blount, he would say, these guys and stuff. I think that's a really cool part about it. Like if you asked a hitter, like if you said to Babe Ruth, oh, who's he's not going to say, oh, the Boston Red Sox. He's going to say, oh, Walter Johnson, or right. This, it's the 1920s, so it is Lefty Rothensaul with the 6-foot mustache, and he's smoking a cigarette on the mound. But I think that's how Dad
throwing a spitter every pitch.
Oh, I always talk to everybody. I love watching the old tapes of any sport from pre-1980. There's always like 4 guys who look like actual athletes. The rest of them all look like they work at a Ford dealership. They smoke 6 packs of cigarettes on the sidelines. They've got, they drink, they're not just drinking whiskey. They're also, while they have a cigarette in. So they're putting the butts into the drink while they do it. Yep. So, but I do miss that part of sports. You watch the old baseball tapes, and there's one guy who's about 60 pounds overweight, got a beard like crazy, they say, oh, here's Fats McGee. He's batting 218 with 32 homers, and makes it to first base in about an hour and a half.
Boog Powell and Mickey Lolich.
Yeah, exactly. It's my favorite part about sports. It's like they talk about how fat Babe Ruth was, but if you look at his numbers, he wasn't really that big of a guy.
No, he just had real thin legs too.
Yeah, he's got these weird legs, but I mean, he could run. He stole bases, and stuff like that.
He stole home plate 8 times.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. It's like somebody would say, about they would say watching them, and of course, part of the fun of sports is debating, who would win this or who did that. And I remember them talking about Babe Ruth, because they were talking about Shohei Ohtani, who's obviously amazing, but they said, oh, Babe Ruth. Well, they said, well, if Babe Ruth was playing now and had a private jet that was taking him to every game and had somebody working on his diet and all, I bet you anything he would be probably just as good as Shohei.
Oh, 100%.
And I think that's the craziest thing, that the thing they can never settle is always how would X do in X era, Yeah.
I mean, no, you're absolutely right. And I know we got to go, but you mentioned Terry Bradshaw earlier, and I tell people about this Bradshaw all the time when he played. Back then, yeah, you didn't want to throw interceptions, but it didn't matter. You threw the ball deep. Because
you see some of those. I love I saw this was a long time ago on Twitter. They said, stats from now, Patrick Mahomes, 22 and 25 for 413 yards, 6 touchdowns, no interceptions, and they're saying it's a bad game. Fran Tarkenton from 1972, 9 of 36, 2 touchdowns, 180 yards, 5 interceptions. Hero of
great
the game.
Yeah, of course.
Great game. I love those old stats.
Oh, absolutely. But Garrett Webster, thank you so much for being my guest. If you're ever up in the Cape Cod area, dinner on me. I mean,
hey, just for a lobster roll, maybe. I watch all those old cooking shows. We'll see.
Oh, anytime. And just thank you for sharing with me. And if somebody wants to follow you on X or whatever, you want to
just call it Twitter. It's Twitter.
Okay. No, I'm with you.
Nobody calls it X.
I don't either. There you go. I just did, but thank you. Yep, it's on Twitter. So follow Garrett Webster on Twitter. Are you on any other social media?
Oh, I'm on everything.
He's on everything. All right. That's
all
you need to know.
Big Web 52. That's me on everything.
But don't call it X.
That's right. Nobody calls it X.
Take care, my friend.
Thank
you so much. Bye now.
Yep. Bye.